بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أما بعد. From the important books that were authored during the 3rd century, or the quote-unquote golden era of the compilation of the Sunnah, and when the ulama were putting together the different books, was that which, or the books that we call Kutub Mukhtalaf al-Hadith, or Kutub Mukhtalif al-Hadith. The books that deal with the problematic or polemic hadith, narrations and traditions that seem to be contradictory or controversial, so on and so forth. And we explained a little bit of this in our last session. We don't want to spend too much more time on that. From the pioneers in this field was Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah, who we all know died in the year 204 of the Hijrah. However, Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah, he didn't he wrote about this and he spoke about this in several places of his authored works. And from them is the famous book which is called Ikhtilaf al-Hadith of Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. Ikhtilaf al-Hadith. Another well-known scholar of Hadith that authored books on the topic, and from those who became well-known with it, was Muhammad, or Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Muslim ibn Qutayba rahimahullah, Ibn Qutayba ad-Dinawari, who died in the year 276. He's commonly referred to as Ibn Qutayba or Ibn Qutayba ad-Dinawari. He died in the year 276. His book is not that large. There are some issues with the book. That's a whole different discussion in itself. And a more famous book was the book of Abu Ja'far Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Tahawi rahimahullah, who's commonly known as and referred to, like many other scholars, if not most of the scholars of the past, with their tribal name or a nickname of their one of their grandfathers, or from their genealogy and lineage. At-Tahawi. Just like Al-Bukhari. That's not his name. It's not his first name or his last name. That's his lineage. The country, or the country in which he's affiliated to, or the city or the town. Or sometime a scholar of hadith of the past, or other than the scholars of hadith, they'll go by the name of their forefathers or one of their grandfathers' nicknames, like Ibn Hajar or Ibn Taymiyyah. It wasn't his name, it wasn't his father's name, it wasn't his grandfather's name. وهكذا. Khair. Al-Tahawi rahimahullah died in the year 321 of the Hijrah, and he has a famous book, or more than one famous book. One of them is called Mushkil al-Athar. Okay, Sharhu Mushkil al-Athar. He has another book called Sharhu Ma'ani al-Athar also. Very exhaustive, extensive work in several volumes, and it's from the most beneficial books on this topic, and also on the topic of Fiqh Sunnah. And those Hadith Mushkila are also from the topic of Fiqh Sunnah. Khair inshallah. These were some of the most important books that were authored during that century. Now, there were a few other books, or even before we move on, this topic was discussed, but it wasn't always discussed in a separate work. We only mentioned a few of the works or the books that were put together separately. But just like it's the science of Hadith, al-Mustalah, Jarh al-Ta'dil, Ilm al-Rijal, these things, they were always spoken about, but they weren't always put into separate books. So we say the first person to write a book on this was Fulan, and the first person to write a book on that was Fulan. Not meaning he was the first person to speak about it, or he wasn't necessarily the pioneer to lay down that science, but we say he was the first person to put it in a separate book, in its own specific volume. Khair inshallah. Another type of another class or genre, subgenre of books that were authored during this 3rd century that were very important, was that, or the books that would be called Kutub as-Sunnah. Kutub as-Sunnah. Not Kutub as-Sunan, but as-Sunnah, with the tar mabut on the end. And what's meant by Sunnah is the correct belief, the authentic Islamic creed, the creed that is proven by the Kitab and the Sunnah, and what the companions agreed upon. That's what's meant by the word Sunnah. In our very first session on this beneficial series, we defined the word Sunnah and explain what it meant according to the different groups and parties of the people of knowledge. So, as we always say, the very first lesson is extremely important. And if you didn't understand something or didn't pay too much attention or thoroughly grasp something in the first lesson, it's going to come back to haunt you in the later lessons, in any field of study. So therefore, please go back to that first lesson if you cannot find or you need some further clarification on this. The word sunnah has several meanings, and from the meanings of the word sunnah is the correct, authentic creed. So some of these scholars, they put books, and the reason why this from compilation of the sunnah, you may ask, this has to do with aqidah. We say that these books were musnada. They had chains of narrations. They collected, they compiled, they brought together narrations. And they put them in their books with their isnads. Okay? So therefore, this is from the service and the steps that were put or taken in compilation of the sunnah. From the most famous of these, and we said they mentioned a hadith, and they also mentioned narrations from the tabi'een and the atba' tabi'een with the isnad. From the most famous of these books is that which was called Sunnah of Abu Bakr ibn Abi Asim, rahimahullah, who died in the year 287. He died in the 3rd century, and he wrote his book, obviously, before he died in the 3rd century, the Golden Era. We also have the Sunnah of Abdullah ibn al-Imam Ahmed, Imam Ahmed's son, Abdullah, who died in the year 290 of the Hijrah. He wrote a book in which he mentions the chains of narration and his ahadith and narrations and statements from his father with regards to the creed. And also a book called Usul al-Sunnah of Abdullah ibn Zubayr al-Humaydi, rahimahullah, the great Sheikh of Imam al-Bukhari. And he died before both of these scholars that we mentioned. He died in the year 219 of the Hijrah. And there were other books, many other books, that had this title or a similar title, and they mention a hadith with isnads. So from one aspect, these books are considered books of aqidah, books of tawheed, books of iman, books of the i'tiqad. And from another aspect, we say these are books of sunnah. And we don't want to go too far off the topic, but this goes back to the concept that in the past, everything was based off of the hadith science. Okay, if you look at the first books of tafsir that were put together, and the most famous books of tafsir and the most popular books, they have what? They have chains of narration in them. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Al-Tabari's tafsir is musnad, and he brings ahadith and athar with his chain. Okay, you look at books of history, even the Arab poets, books of fiqh, they all mention their chains of narration. So hadith, that was everything. Okay, and then they just branched off, but the science of hadith was used and put into play. And this goes to show how the science of hadith and its study and its field of expertise, without a doubt, is superior. It is superior. Quran with hadith, fiqh is with hadith, history with hadith, seerah with hadith, aqidah with hadith. So a person can never do without hadith. And as the wise man said, talking about the superiority of the science of hadith, he said that the hadith science is the servant, and the rest of the sciences receive treatment. They receive service. Hadith is the khadim. It goes and it helps out the faqih, the one who talks about fiqh. It helps out the historian. It helps out the one who wants to prove this point of creed. It helps out. وهكذا. Khayr, inshallah. Let's move on to the 4th and 5th century. Now we want to discuss the 4th and 5th century. In brief, of course, in summary, we finished speaking about the 3rd century, the Golden Era. Now, what happened in the 4th century? And what happened in the 5th century. Now, the people of knowledge, they continue to write books, and they continue to serve the sunnah and offer service to it, and compile it, and they continue to refine, okay, and cultivate what their predecessors had started. They took those steps, those major steps, and they made them even longer and even greater strides, okay, into leaps. So they took the baton and they took the torch from their predecessors, but they went on and they wanted to refine this great heritage. Khayran, inshallah. Now, there are two different things here with regards to the compilation of the Sunnah in the 4th and 5th century. Firstly is there were books that were authored without no new styles, no new techniques, but they just continued to do more of what was already done, such as musnads, such as kutub of sunan, as we explained before, such as sihah or sahihs. In other words, scholars came after the end of the 3rd century and wrote more books on similar topics. Okay, whether they were longer, whether they were shorter, whether they had their own hadith, whether they had isnads from those other scholars, whether they put different chapter headings and more benefits. What's important is that they continued to make books of the previous genres. Okay, musnads, sunans, and sahihs. Also, we had different books that were new, books that introduced new styles and new techniques, books that gave a different angle, books that shed light on different aspects of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, from those books, or before we move on, let's pay a little more attention here on books that served some of those previous books, because we spoke about the refinement process. And when you refine something, you take a substance or matter that is already there, and then you take it through a process of refinement. So we don't want to move on too fast before we correctly understand this. We don't want to misunderstand this. In other words, the Sahih books, the Musnad books, the Sunan books that were previously put together in the 3rd century, scholars in the 4th century, scholars in the 5th century took those books and they did service to them. They did service to Bukhari, service to Tirmidhi, service to some of those books that came before. Everybody clear on this? Also, we had ulama who went on to write their own Sahih collections. Okay? Whether those hadith could be found in Bukhari and Muslim with their own chains, through their own routes and of transmission or not. But he said, okay, now I'm going to put together a book and I'm going to call it my Sahih. Okay? And these are the hadith that I believe is authentic. And so on and so forth. Everybody clear on this? From these scholars, we have about maybe 3 or 4 main books that we want to discuss in brief. The first of them is the book of Ibn Khuzaymah. Ibn Khuzaymah, rahimahullah. And he died in the year 311. Then we have the book of his brilliant pupil, the book of Ibn Hibban, rahimahullah, who died in the year 354 of the Hijrah. And then we have, or before him came Ibn as-Sakin, who died 353. But his book, unfortunately, didn't survive up to this current day, and it didn't reach the critical acclaim and status of Ibn Hibban. Also, there's a book which is not necessarily called a Sahih, but it has that concept of authenticity according to the author. And it is a book of a scholar who's commonly referred to as Ibn al-Jarud. Ibn al-Jarud died in the beginning of this century. He died in the year 307. And the name of his book was called Al-Muntaqa, which literally means the selected narrations, or the chosen narrations. Now, we previously mentioned that An-Nasa'i, rahimahullah, died in the year 303. So somebody may say, well, how is he put into that 3rd century? We say because he lived during the 3rd century, and he studied, and he took, and he passed on narrations during that century. Khairan, inshallah. Ibn Khuzaymah, his name is Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Khuzaymah al-Naysaburi, rahimahullah. So we see he was also from the country of who? Of Imam Muslim, rahimahullah. Imam Muslim was from Nishapur and the Far East. The name of his book wasn't necessarily as-Sahih, but it was similar to the book of Imam Muslim, in which he called it Al-Musnad al-Sahih. He called it Al-Musnad al-Sahih. And there's a longer version of the name. Khair, inshallah. This is in similarity, or in summary. Now, from the books, or from the different distinguishing features of his book, was that he put it together in a very, very good way. His chapter headings were clear. Rather, in his book, he mentions a hadith and he declares them to be weak in his book. And that doesn't necessarily tarnish the title Sahih, because he's telling you that it's weak. Okay? And the hadith that he quotes and brings that doesn't, and he doesn't criticize them, then according to him, we quote again, not according to all of the ulama, but according to him, are considered to be genuine. Khairan, inshallah. In his book, he mentioned the different narrators, their names, distinguishing between their names and their titles and their by names, things like this. And it's very similar to the work of Muslim, rahimahullah. There's no doubt that Ibn Khuzaymah was influenced and he benefited a lot from the book of Imam Muslim, rahimahullah. Khairan, inshallah. Then we have the book of the scholar Abu Hatim, Muhammad ibn Hibban al-Busti as-Sijistani. And we see that he was from the place of who? Abu Dawood, from Sijistan. Okay? And he called his book Al-Musnad al-Sahih al-Taqasimi wal-Anwa' to the end of the title. His book was a bit different, whereas he didn't necessarily organize his book according to all of the chapter headings. He had chapter headings in there, but it wasn't organized. It was organized according to the different classes of hadith. In other words, to keep things brief, he mentioned a hadith based off of the different things that the hadith benefited. Hadith that were based off of commands, hadiths that were based off of prohibitions, hadith that were based off of information. And that's very different and very unique, and he was a trailblazer in that style. No one had done that before him. Okay, the scholars who came before him organized their books according to one or two ways. Either al abwab, yani the fiqh chapter headings, or al-masanid, according to the companion who narrated those hadith. Ibn Hibban, rahimahullah, he came along and he didn't do that. Now, Ibn Hibban, we don't want to go too deep. However, he was khaif, that's it. Because that's going to take us to the whole long discussion. And then we have the book of Abdullah ibn Ali, who is commonly referred to as Ibn al-Jarud, rahimahullah. And he was from Naysabur, of the country of Muslim. And we said that he died in the year 307. His book is very small, relatively small. Okay, it's compiled according to the books of fiqh and the subchapter headings. Okay, and it's with the different ahadith which are attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and some hadith or some narrations attributed to the companions. Alright, he has about 1,114 ahadith in his book. Approximately, okay? And most of those ahadith are found in the 6 books of hadith that we explained, and there's only about maybe less than 30 hadith that can only be found in his book that are in the Kutub Sitta. Khair, inshallah. Another book that we have that was considered to be further service of the previous authored books was the book of Al-Hakim, rahimahullah. Al-Hakim died in the year 405. Okay, and he also was from Nishapur. He also was Naysaburi, like Muslim, rahimahullah. Al-Hakim was Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and his kunya was Abu Abdullah, rahimahullah ta'ala. And the name of his book is called Al-Mustadrak al-Sahihain. And what's meant by the term Mustadrak is a book in which the author takes narrations and a hadith that he believes and sees fulfill the standards of another book, but they aren't found in those other books. In other words, for example, the hadith or the conditions of Bukhari, and how he grades a hadith to be authentic, and the highest grade of authenticity that he sees and what he believes and what he thinks is the most authentic hadith, he looks and he finds these other hadith that aren't found in Bukhari but fulfill those standards, and he puts them in his book. And similarly, those hadith of Imam Muslim. So that's what's meant by a mustadrak. That's what's meant by a mustadrak. Now, Al-Hakim's book, in brief, is a very, very large book. Now, some people, it's been printed in about maybe 4 large volumes. And it has a new modern day editing or edited version, which may be bigger. Now, there's a lot of controversy surrounding Al-Hakim's level of grading those hadith, mistakes, hadith that he says were on the conditions of Bukhari and Muslim, but they really weren't, or some of those hadith were actually in the book, and many of the hadith he was correct. It's a long topic. We cannot get that, and we cannot get into that right now. Also, his leniency, but that's a very long issue. Al-Muhim is that Al-Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala is a very beneficial work and addition that he added to the Islamic library and to the hadith culture. We will stop here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.